I just want to acknowledge the contribution from Michael O'Connor from CSIRO, Cameron Weeks from Plan Farm, and Doug Arbrecht, Rob Griemer and Peter Newman, who've all contributed substantially to this little topic we're going to talk about now. So what I want to cover over the next 25 minutes or so is just give you some background to what I see as the issues around dry sowing, have a look at some past historical climate data and look at this issue of the timing of the break and the issue around dry seeding. Look at some economic benefits we believe you can put on dry sowing, but then also counter that with a discussion around some of the risks that we see dry sowing brings to a farmer's operation. And then finish with a bit of a hit list, I suppose, of some key success points we think need to be thought of when thinking about dry sowing in any particular situation. For those of you who want to hear the Reader's Digest version and nod off now, read this slide and then you can relax. Our analysis does show that yes, for many of our areas the break has been getting later and more variable, patchy. And when we do try and put some economic numbers on the benefits of dry sowing, they are considerable in average terms. But then you've got to take into account many of the risks involved. We believe many of these risks can be managed though, and I'm going to cover those throughout the course of the talk. Dry seeding, I think it's important to think of it as part of an integrated package where you have to get all sorts of other parts of the system working in concert with it for it to work properly. It's not a technology or a practice that you can really look at in isolation. So, yes, as Ralph said, this is an issue that's getting more and more a feature of our farming system, I guess, and it's because of this perception that breaks are getting later and more variable in terms of their quality. We also have, in conjunction with that, larger farms, bigger cropping programs, more pinches on machinery capacity and labour availability, so that means people are needing to get bigger programs in with less resources faster. And while lupins and canola have traditionally been dry sown in our system for many years now, with a fair bit of confidence, I think this question around the role of dry sowing cereals in our system hasn't received nearly as much attention, and that's really what I'm going to concentrate on now. But there are risks involved in sowing large areas dry, and certainly there are growers out there who are sowing large proportions of their program dry now, with, they believe, a fair bit of confidence. The reason why I guess we're concentrating on wheat is we think it's really one of the lowest, together with barley, the lowest risk crop that you can sow dry, because its seeding window is the widest of all of our possible crops, and so if it's going to emerge late or in a compromised way, it's most likely going to return a profit compared to our other options, our other cropping options, if they were to be also sown dry. And so really it's overall the most resilient crop type you can consider dry sowing. Together with also, if you have a problematic weed problem following dry sowing, then you've probably got more options in a cereal system than you have maybe in some of our broadleafs. So we've gone back and had a look at some historical climate data to try and get a handle on what's been happening to the break. We define the break using this rule that's been elicited from farmers by asking them how much rain would they need to get over, say, a 3-day period for them to trigger sowing a crop. And that rule basically says they reckon they need about 20 millimetres around Anzac Day when the window opens, falls to about 5 millimetres by the middle of June, and then from that thereafter. And then together with that, saying that a dry sown crop would germinate on about a 7 mil rainfall event. That's also what a similar elicitation process was got from farmers. So we've taken those two rules and run them through historical climate data, and sure enough, they do reveal that the sowing season has become, what we call the sowing season, has become more variable. If you just take Mullawar for a start, these blue bars represent the start of the wet sowing period. So the first wet day is the bottom part of the blue bar, and then the length of the bar represents how long you take to get 10 days of wet sowing. And it's certainly pretty obvious from earlier than the mid-70s that it was a fairly consistent, I guess, pattern to the break and that length of the wet seeding period. But then certainly from then on, I think, to my eye anyway, it's got more variable, and then certainly from in the 2000s there's been a number of very late breaks, a number of very long periods needed to get 10 days of wet seeding, and certainly, you know, obvious implications for the riskiness of getting crops established. If you then look at another low rainfall location, and my talk today is concentrating on the low rainfall areas because that's, I guess, where dry seeding is a big feature of our system. Similar patterns emerge, even in a place like Merredin, which has a fairly different attitude about dry seeding amongst the grower community, a lot more conservative approach, you might say. Certainly from the early 80s, a lot more variation from year to year in terms of when that wet sowing period started, and even well into the 2000s, certainly some very late breaks and very extended patchy breaks. When it comes to looking at the dry sowing question, we've actually gone and looked at days that are both very dry, the soil is very dry, and so it's safe to dry sow, and that's what this bar graph shows, is basically the number of dry sowing days available in conjunction with those wet sowing days, defined very strictly according to having a dry soil down to 20 centimetres, so a very conservative approach to dry sowing. And certainly there are lots of years there when that really strict rule isn't met. So you need to go to a more relaxed rule about dry seeding, which is then the green bars that are stacked on top of those pale bars, where we actually say, okay, you could dry seed if you had up to, say, 30% plant available water in that top 20 centimetres. And in that case, then, you certainly do end up with seeing about 30 or 40 days available for dry seeding. These are days that are dry enough for dry seeding and too dry for wet seeding. And sure enough, because the breaks have been getting later and more patchy in recent times, we are seeing the climate record indicating that there has been a compensation there in terms of an increased number of days suitable for dry sowing, particularly in the last 10 years. If you put that relaxed rule for dry sowing, which are the red points here, plotted on the right-hand axis there, over on top of those wet seeding seasonal graphs that you saw before, you can see here what I'm saying is that sure enough we are getting more dry seeding days here when the break is later, but there are a few problematic years when it's actually too wet to dry sow and the break is late. They're bastard years. They're years when, like 1999 here, when you had very few dry seeding days because soil was just too moist to risk it, but nonetheless the break was, you know, mid to late May, and those are the difficult years when the risks around dry sowing are certainly going to become more prevalent. So what we've done is taken that historical climate information and plugged it into a little economic model we've built, because we wanted to try and estimate for a whole farm basis what's the benefit of sowing, you know, 100 hectares, 1,000 hectares, 2,000 hectares dry on average year in, year out. And the components of that little economic calculation involve the number of days for seeding, which you've just seen, some assumptions about the size of the cropping program you're doing the analysis for, the area that you're going to sow dry, if there's any delay in getting the wet seeding started because you're waiting for a weed germination and a knockdown, the daily rate of seeding, so how many hectares a day you can get in with your seeding gear, and then finally how yield potential falls off as you delay sowing. And of course that's the big advantage here we're trying to estimate, is if a dry sown area gets up on 7 mils of rain well before the wet sown area gets going, that's where your yield advantage is going to occur, because those earlier sown crops are going to have a higher yield potential. And we get that last bit by generating a whole lot of yield versus time of sowing curves that we can generate using our crop simulation model. And these are just some examples for Mullawar of those time of sowing yield curves. You can see they do vary enormously from year to year. So a lot of people say, yeah, okay, it's 40 kilos a hectare per day for every day you delay sowing. But in some years, in fact, the response is really quite flat. In some years, it's actually quite curvilinear, where in other years it is that classic sort of drop-off at 40 or 35 kilos per day beyond about the middle of May. So we plug those yield response curves into this little economic calculation as well to look at the advantage of getting a crop in earlier by having it dry sown. And what you come up with then is an estimate of how much the wheat program yields on average as a function of varying the area dry sown. And these are calculations averaged over 30 years of climate data for a 3,000 hectare program at Mullawar, assuming that all of the country there is light land. So a number of assumptions here. And sure enough, you can see that as you increase the area of dry sown, sure enough, the average whole farm yield increases as you might expect. And that's because not only is the dry sown stuff coming up earlier and having a high yield potential, but you're getting the wet sown stuff in earlier as well, because you're able to start that earlier and get it finished earlier, therefore having a high yield potential. And you can see it certainly starts to flatten off a little bit after, say, 1,000 or so hectares. The green curve there is just showing you the effect of not having that knockdown delay period, that 10-day initial delay in getting your wet sown area in. That's just demonstrating that that's actually worth about 0.2 of a tonne in this case when you're not dry seeding any country, but of course the gap narrows as you get a lot of dry sown country in because you're sowing less wet sown area, and so that delay has less importance. If we look at the other issue of, what about just increasing seeding capacity instead of sowing dry? Let's just buy a bigger air seeder, or let's drive the rig 24 hours a day and buy another labour unit to do that. And certainly, if you vary the seeding rate from 100 to 200 to 300 hectares a day, you get an increase in overall farm grain yield because the crop's getting in faster. And the impact, of course, of dry seeding area is stronger where you have a slower seeding capacity. So the purple line there is the slowest rate of seeding capacity, about 100 hectares a day. As you would imagine intuitively, when you have a slow seeding capacity, getting as much of the crop in dry helps you then get your wet sown area in as early as possible. And so these benefits I'm showing, I guess, are average benefits. They're very optimistic estimates of the benefits of dry sowing because they don't account for the risks of dry sown areas encountering a false break, a dry spell following germination, and hence compromised emergence. So they are basically a best possible estimate of what we think the benefits are. And so, of course, we have to overlay that with the risks. And we've gone out and interviewed a number of growers, particularly from the northern region, and found out what their attitudes are around the risks for dry seeding, and learnt a little bit about how they get around those risks. And I want to just run through that a little bit now. Frost, of course, isn't so much an issue in the northern region, but you certainly hear it being cited as a reason against dry seeding further south. These other issues, of course, are pretty prevalent throughout the wheat belt, and I want to go through them one by one now and just talk to you about them. Weeds is obviously, I think, the most important risk, and the one here, of course, is weeds germinating with the dry sown crop, and that's going to be a particular problem where you have a lack of post-emergence control options. And the obvious response to that, of course, is to have a really well planned out, thought through IWM plan. And I'm not going to steal too much of Peter Newman's thunder. He's going to talk about that next in the next talk in this session. But planning out your clean weedy paddocks for dry sowing is the obvious response to this risk. Frost, as I said, is an issue in frost-prone areas, and the big issue there is around having a large area of a dry sown crop coming up at once and potentially being flowering in a frost window. And there's a pretty good information now around from the Ag Department and other sources around the risks involved of certain varieties sown at certain times. Jeff Fosbury showed some of that stuff this morning from the Yield Profit. And this is just another way of expressing what Jeff showed this morning, really, is the frost risk for cunderdin as a function of sowing date for 3 different maturing varieties. And it just shows you very clearly there about the earliest possible sowing date you'd be willing to risk to minimise your frost risk at flowering. Committing inputs, I think, is another significant risk around dry sowing, because you don't know when that dry sown area is going to come up, and if you've committed too much, or if that crop fails, you've done your dough. And so I suppose this is a simple gross margin that Cameron Weeks has done based on planned farm data for his part of the world. A complete wipeout, basically, you're standing to risk $120 a hectare. And And of course, these other yields here, which assume a wheat price of $250 a tonne, by the way, these other figures here basically show you what you're putting at risk if the crop was to be compromised in some way or another. And of course, one way of managing that risk is to commit minimal inputs up front, and we're all familiar now with the idea of committing minimal nitrogen up front and then topping up with liquid nitrogen. Phosphorus, of course, is a trickier one. One really intriguing strategy we've heard from one grower is that he has now built up his soil peer reserves to a point now where he believes they can basically buffer any kind of yield potential he could be looking at. And so he doesn't commit any fertiliser, or very little, just maybe a few kilos to help seedling establishment, but then uses a replacement approach to basically replace the following year what he took out the year before. So that's one way of being a bit flexible about committing the phosphorus side of things. Wind erosion is another thing, and we met growers who are very reluctant to dry sow because of this issue of cultivating dry soil, particularly where you've got low ground cover. And often, of course, the paddocks you're going to dry sow into are the ones that have either come out of fallow or come out of a break crop or come out of pasture, and so do tend to have lower ground cover. And so I guess there just needs to be a very conscious decision there around conserving those crop residues where they are and only planning on dry sowing paddocks where you know you're going to have a reasonable amount of ground cover to protect it against wind erosion. And harking back to Steve's presentation, non-wetting is also a significant risk. So this question of having a compromised germination from a dry sowing situation when that non-wetting behaviour hasn't completely broken down with the opening rains. And I guess there's some technologies there you heard of in the previous talk that can help maybe overcome that risk in conjunction with a dry sowing situation. So the final one is one that you don't hear about much, but certainly some growers do cite it as a significant factor when they think about the proportion of their program they're willing to sow dry. If they have limited capacity to service that dry sown area, when it does finally germinate, spraying it, fertilising it, then that will certainly figure in terms of how much they're willing to commit dry sowing. So I guess when you look at all this, there are a number of risks involved in dry sowing sizeable areas, but nonetheless I think many of them are manageable, and you can go into dry sowing with some very clear understanding of the size of those risks and how you can potentially mitigate them. So I want to sort of bring the talk to a finish by talking a bit about what I guess the people with industry experience on this paper see as being the key success points for dry sowing, and many of it reiterates what I've just been going through. So a lot of it's around integrating it with an integrated weed management plan to ensure that dry seeding occurs into clean paddocks, picking the paddocks and crop types that you're willing to dry seed carefully, being conscious about input costs. This one's an interesting one, and a lot of growers do this. They look at the long-term forecast and they wait until they think they've got a good long-term forecast, and then they'll get out there and they'll sow a sizeable area dry, pretty confident that it's going to germinate in a few days' time when that front finally comes through. So waiting, I suppose, and that's I guess what that image is trying to depict as well, as the concept of waiting. Furrow sowing to help bring a dry sown crop up, and notwithstanding Steve's comments in the previous talk around some of the issues around furrow sowing, and then cover conservation to help with the wind erosion risk. So a lot of what this is really, I think, bringing the discussion around to is I think dry seeding needs to be thought about as an integrated technology. So you need to have your rotation set up, your residue management thought through, your plan for input management to minimise risks, and matching all of that with your capacity of plant and labour to service that dry sown area. So it can't be an issue that's sort of seen in isolation. It needs to be thought through in concert with all of these things, and the risks and the returns thought through carefully. So just going back to my take-home messages that I started with, yes, the break definitely has been getting more variable and later and patchy, and that's been particularly obvious in the last 10 years. And, you know, we are seeing, if you do some simple economic calculations, you know, up to half a program is looking like you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of dry sowing in the calculations we looked at, and, you know, up to 0.2, 0.3 average increase on whole farm yield. So pretty substantial gains in a low rainfall situation, but there are risks. And so you could argue, well, why should you go beyond, say, sowing half your program dry if you know that you're going to be putting a great deal at risk? But, you know, there are ways to manage some of these risks and go into this with a very clear picture of what the risks are. And so for those of you, I guess, who are in the business of advising farmers, I think I'd urge you to think through the whole dry sowing thing as very much an integrated strategy that's got to be connected to all the other parts of the management of a cropping program. Thanks for your attention.
What's your opinion on the effect on non-wetting soils of dry seeding?
I mean, I'm only going on what other people have told me about the risks that some growers cite, James, and it seems to be mainly around this fact that you get this very uneven pattern of wetting. I mean, if a dry sown crop can in theory germinate on only as little as 7 millimetres, and you get this very uneven pattern of wetting that Steve showed in his previous talk, then you're going to look, you know, you're looking at a very potentially disastrous situation in terms of emergence. So that to me is the key issue. I'm be interested to hear what other people think the issue is, and that seems to be the big factor. That if you wait though until the break opens properly, then you've got some time then for that non-wetting behaviour to break down, your weeds to germinate, blah blah blah. Then you're ready to go in with maybe a bit more confidence. I think that.
I just wondered, this half wet, half dry, as the season gets later, that must become less of a concern, because really you've got a fortnight where it's not really an issue. You know, if it's going to germinate because it's just wet enough. Well, from my experience, we used to talk about the grain moulding or whatever. I haven't experienced that. It'll sit there forever. So, if you like, from my experience, I'd encourage people not to hesitate on that. Otherwise, you hesitate forever.
So Kit, what's your particular approach to dry seeding? Kit Leeks from the Central Wheatbelt.
I'm in love with it. Simple as that. It's the only way to farm, honestly. And I've become obsessed by it. One of the things is it takes pressure off. You got machinery going, daylight hours, and the last 2 years it's made a huge impact on our profit. Definitely.
Like Kit, I'm in love with it as well. But obviously we've got to watch the weeds, and we've got to understand the texture of the soil. Heavy soil, you haven't got any subsoil moisture, the risk becomes too high the later you go. So I think a lot of people throw in chemical fallowing in as well, but you didn't mention that much. I guess you did in as much as lack of residue in the chemical fallow. Oh, heavier soils, how much of that would you want to put in your model to give you improved yields?
So what's the particular issue about heavier soils, Bill?
Well, it just takes more water to get the heavy soils germinated. It becomes so risky.
Yeah, no, this initial analysis I've shown you today has been mainly around lighter country, but we're going to add in the heavier country issues with it. Yes, and they obviously require more wetting up. The flip side of that, of course, is because they have a wider plant available water capacity, when they are dry, they are safer to dry because they are going to be, less often in that danger zone when you're worrying about things like moulding and so on.
Mike, in the interviews that you had with the different growers up north, did they mention anything like yield increase, or was it just a benefit in terms of logistics?
No, they commonly cite that dry sown crops have a higher yield potential, and part of that's because they come up earlier than wet sown crops, and it's because they tend to be sown into cleaner paddocks as well. Then they often have a lower weed burden, and so have a higher yield because of that too. So there's both those factors, but then in terms of the whole farm benefits, then there's flow-on effects for you being able to get your wet sown part of the program in earlier as well, because you've already got the dry sown area out of the way. So that wet sown area therefore has a higher yield potential. So all of those factors are ones that get cited by people.